Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome everyone to the first guest lecture at Dar al-Qasim for the spring of 2021. Tonight we are honored to be joined by Professor Ahmed El Shamsy, who will be speaking on print's effects on Arabic literature. So Professor El Shamsi is an associate professor of Islamic thought at the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations at the University of Chicago. He studies the intellectual history of Islam, focusing on the evolution and the classical Islamic disciplines and scholarly culture within their broader historical context. His research addresses themes such as orality and literacy, the history of the book, and the theory and practice of Islamic law. So without further ado, Professor Shamsi.
Assalamu alaikum. Good evening to all of you who are watching. This is all, even though we are almost at the end of the first year of our strange predicament, still unusual for me to give a speech towards a camera rather than seeing people in front of me and seeing who is there and seeing the audience. And of course, part of speaking is also, seeing the reaction of the audience, seeing who is there, seeing people either nodding, understanding, or not understanding. So it is more of a challenge to kind of lecture into the void more than in the presence of a living and breathing audience. So excuse me if it's maybe not as natural as it would have been if we were in the same room. On the other hand, of course, this is this type of medium lends itself to more people attending such a lecture, and that's a positive thing. And I hope that you'll benefit from what I've got to say tonight to you. So my lecture is about my recent book. It was published in February 2020. It's called Rediscovering the Islamic Classics. And given that Dar al-Qasim is a seminary, I wanted to start from that kind of perspective, from the perspective of a seminary student who I would assume enters a seminary with the idea of learning about the Islamic religious tradition. Now, what is a tradition? When one starts learning a field, it is difficult at the beginning to just get the outlines of it, to understand the basic lay of the land, the basic elements that this field has. And for me, I've done myself some traditional studies. That's been 20 years ago now, but I still remember very well. And for me, really, the place where I tried to kind of get a macro view of the Islamic tradition was the library or the bookshop in the Middle East, where you can see the various fields, the various shelves that represent the various fields of Islamic thought in front of you. But at the same time, when you look at the Islamic tradition from that perspective, that is also kind of a two-dimensional perspective, because you see books that were written 1200 years ago and books that were written 800 years ago, or that were written in North Africa or in West Africa or in Iraq or in Central Asia or in India. They're all together. They're all together there. They're nicely printed, and that's how we access them today. I don't know. Maybe these days, of course, we can also access them online. We can access them as PDFs, but the point of my book is to investigate what happened with print, and to what extent did print not just change the literature that we look at from being written by hand on paper to being printed on paper. Is it more than that? And what I'm arguing is that yes, we definitely see a change in the nature of the way we think about the classics of Islamic thought. So the classics, when I teach a class on, the great books of Islamic thought, for example, these works that I consider to be the great works of of theology or philosophy or law or hadith or Quranic exegesis or Islamic history or so. And what I want to the point that I want to make to you today is that print has really changed the landscape of Islamic classics and what it is that people actually consider to represent the Islamic classics, that you have to know, that you have to read to be educated in the Islamic intellectual tradition. And to start with a kind of example of this, let me start with the great Iraqi exegete of the Quran, Abu Thana Mahmud al-Alusi, who wrote in the 1830s and 40s of the 19th century, about 170 years ago now, the last great Ottoman tafsir, the Ruh al-Ma'ani, that he wrote 30 volumes, was published in the late 19th century. And this is a great tafsir. It's a famous tafsir and rightly considered to be as the great late Ottoman tafsir that was written in Baghdad. And the question I asked myself is, what are the books that Al-Alusi in the 19th century, just before print or just before Islamic works were started to be printed, what were the books that he had access to in writing his book? So, I have my office. Unfortunately, I have been exiled from it for a while now, but in my office I have various tafsir works that I draw on. And just one simple example, one of the great, in a sense, the great tafsir of the Quran is At-Tabari's tafsir that he wrote in the 10th century of the Common Era, in Baghdad. And so I asked myself the question: did Al-Alusi know this tafsir? Did he have access to it? Because it wasn't printed by that time. It was only printed in, I think, 1902, the first time it was printed. So in the 1830s, do we assume that he just went to a madrasa library or to a public library and looked at a manuscript, or to what extent did he have access to it? So I looked at Al-Alusi's tafsir, and there you go. There he quotes At-Tabari hundreds of times. But of course, 900 times I counted. But of course, that doesn't actually yet prove that he had access to At-Tabari's tafsir. And if one uses kind of digital methods, we have these texts in digital form. One can check this, and it turns out that Al-Alusi, all the times he cites At-Tabari, he cites it either from a 14th century Andalusian commentator, Abu Hayyan, from his Bahr al-Muhit, or from the 16th century Egyptian scholar Suyuti and his tafsir, Ad-Dur al-Manthur. So there is in fact no evidence that Al-Alusi read the tafsir of At-Tabari or had access to the tafsir of At-Tabari. So that's strange. I have a copy of the tafsir of At-Tabari, and any one of you can download this work as a PDF, within a few seconds if you want to. So that's a kind of beginning question of what was available to people before print, and that's a question I start my book with. So just as a background, my book does not talk about the entire Islamic world. It focuses on Arabic-speaking Muslim countries. So the kind of the main focus is Egypt, because print begins and for a long time is centered on Egypt. But the question I really have is what happens to book culture in Arab countries. It has some relevance for non-Arabic countries, but I do focus on Arabic-speaking countries. And so the first point that I make in my book is that just before print was introduced in Egypt, it was in 1821, there was a dearth of books. There were comparatively few books around in Arabic-speaking Muslim countries compared to today. If you know anything about the history of the book in the Islamic world, of course, is a book that had a very rich, long, and wide tradition of writing books, particularly once the Muslim world adopted paper in the 8th century, so about a century and a half after the death of the Prophet Muhammad. Muslims adopted the material of paper. Before that, they had written on things like if you read about the early Qur'ans were written on flat stones, on camel bones, on wood, on palm leaves, or on parchment. Parchment is a type of leather, so it's an animal skin. So these very early manuscripts of the Qur'an that we have today, they were written on parchment. Of course, they also had papyrus, but they did not have paper. And then once they adopted paper, there really was a boom in book culture. Paper is a very good, very relatively cheap material. It's a reliable material. You can bind books in a nice way that you can't do, for example, with papyrus. Obviously, you can't do with stones or whatever, palm leaves. And it's much, much cheaper than animal skins. So the adoption of paper in the 8th century really led to a boom in book production. But then the question is, what happened later on? And we, of course, in the 16th century, the Arabic-speaking countries, to a large degree, ceased to be independent polities. Egypt and Syria, that were kind of at that point the kind of dominant cultural and intellectual centers, become part of the Ottoman Empire. Iraq is divided between the Ottomans and the Safavids in Iran, and so the Arabic-speaking countries cease to be self-governing, and they become mere provinces, which has several kind of negative effects on book culture. So first of all is, where are books kept? Muslims have libraries. They have libraries that are attached to madrasas, that are attached to mosques. Not so much really kind of self-standing libraries, but libraries that are attached to other institutions, libraries attached to hospitals, for example, or to Sufi lodges, or palace libraries. But very often these libraries that are publicly accessible, they're financed by endowments, by pious endowments, awqaf, right? So somebody gives a piece of maybe their land, or a market, or a building, or a well, and say, okay, this I donate to God, right? And therefore the proceed from this will go to a specific pious charitable cause, such as the library. So they would buy, such as a library in a mosque or somewhere, or in a madrasa. So they would build this, and then they would have something that yields profit that would then be used to support. In case of a library, that supports a librarian, right? That supports people who recopy books that get damaged, and so on and so on. The problem is that while in theory these endowments are perpetual, i.e. they are forever, they don't have like an end point, you do need to have constant investment. Right? If you don't have constant investment, let's say the original building needs a renovation, and then the question is, does the revenue producing endowed thing, whether it's a marketplace or a building, whatever, does it create enough revenue to repair this? And over time, if you can imagine, not just decades but centuries, if this endowment isn't added to, these institutions fall into disrepair, and that's something that happens in the Arab Muslim world in the time period between the 16th and 19th century. So In the 19th century, for example, we find that the only madrasa in Cairo that still works, that is still open as a madrasa, that still educates people, is Al-Azhar. Even though in the late 15th century there were still over 70 madrasas there. Right? So by the 19th century there's only one madrasa left. It's Al-Azhar. It's obviously it's a big place, but you can see that the local wealth that was there to support learning had decreased. There were now other centers of learning, Istanbul, places in Iran, for example, places in India, that's true. But in Egypt, it definitely decreased. And what happens to books at this point? These books also left, even though they were theoretically endowed in these institutions. If, for example, the librarian isn't paid anymore, the librarian isn't there anymore, what happens to the books? Right? What happens if there's a hole in the roof, for example, of the library? Then it's better to sell it. Or what if the librarian doesn't get paid anymore and then starts selling the books or something like this? So you have an outflow of books out of Arabic-speaking countries, starting in the 16th century. With the Ottoman conquest, the Ottomans obviously, the newly ruling elites, they had lots of money. They built their own libraries, their own institutions. And they were willing to pay for this stuff, so books moved to the Ottoman Empire, and of course still today Istanbul has some of the richest Arabic manuscript libraries in the world. While there's a nice example, or maybe not nice, but an example that gives you a good idea of what happened is the Mahmudiyya Library in Cairo, which was one of the very fine libraries that had very rare books, rare classical works. And so in the 15th century, it had 4,000 volumes of books. And by the 19th century, when the holdings of the Mahmudiyya Library were transported to the newly established National Library, the Dar al-Kutub al-Misriya, there were only 58 books of those 4,000 books left. So that's a little bit more than 1% of the original holding. What is one of the reasons for this decrease I've already mentioned is a kind of material reason. There's less financing for institutions of bookkeeping, of book preservation like libraries. But there is also, I'm making that argument in my book, there is another reason for this kind of disappearance, but particularly of classical works, is that you have something that I call, and I think a kind of a scholastic mode in Islamic learning that becomes powerful in the kind of 16th, 17th, 18th century, which is that even the kind of libraries that do flourish and that get founded in that time period, that have hundreds of works and they don't have as many books as in earlier ages, but they have significant holdings. But if you look at their holdings, you find that they focus, for each field they have like a rather limited number of texts, and then on these texts they have a large number of commentaries, and sometimes commentaries on commentaries, and sometimes commentaries on commentaries on commentaries. So it's a limited set of texts with a commentary tradition that was written in the 14th, 15th, 16th, 17th, 18th century, and that were not anymore interested in the kind of really early texts, 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th century, the kind of Abbasid era texts that we so often are interested in today. So what scholasticism did was it was a movement in which specific texts that were used for teaching as well. And so many of these texts we are familiar with from seminary teaching. Still today we still use them because they are useful teaching texts. But it's not just that they were teaching texts, but they were in fact the texts that were used for a specific field. So rather than saying, okay, you study with this, you start with this teaching text to give you a basic understanding of the field, and then you go and read other texts. People remained within this text, within the specific text, so that they were experts in this text, and then experts within the commentaries on this text. So specific texts represented the cutting edge in the field, right? You know, if you think about whatever Hanafi fiqh, I assume from, most people here will be interested more in Hanafi fiqh. There was, like some of the just very well-known teaching texts and their commentaries, and that's what Hanafism was about. Nobody read, I don't know, a Shaybani's Kitab al-Asl, for example, or even like Al-Jassas's Ahkam al-Quran, or Al-Tahawi's work on Ikhtilaf al-Fuqaha, or something like this. So these texts, while they still existed, I mean but only a few copies of them did exist, and so part of the story of these texts, the reason why we have them today, why we're familiar with them, is that they were discovered in the age of print, and through print they were reintroduced into the cultural bloodstream of Islamic thought. Right. So the magic that print is able to do is, if one copy survives, in a month or two we can have 2,000 copies. In the age of of actually where you have to write stuff by hand, that takes longer. I mean, no single person can write 2,000 copies of a book. So you would need a large movement of people. But with print, you can have a small print shop that mass produces texts, and that is what is culturally significant here. So let me backtrack a little bit and talk about print. So when I talk about print here, I primarily mean movable type print. So that there is print. I don't know, those of you who I don't know when you grew up, but in my days, kids still, you did some things like potato prints. I don't know whether that makes rings any bells to you. You can kind of carve things into like a cut potato and then put it in ink and then start printing with it, right? That's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is movable print, which is a technology in which you typeset words with individual letters on a typesetting board, and then you use this to basically put it into ink, and then you put it onto paper. So you don't have to carve a material, whether it's wood or some sort of soft metal or whatever, but you typeset it by means of individual letters that you put together, and then you use that to print. You can do this 1,000 times. Then you typeset a new page, and you do that 1,000 times, and so on until you're done with the book. That is a technology that was developed in Germany in the 15th century by a man called Gutenberg. You might have heard about him, who produced these famous Bibles. So it was a technology that really took off in the late 15th century, in the 16th century. Among Muslims, however, was not adopted for quite a while. It was only in the 18th century when in Istanbul, Ibrahim Mutafarrika started to print a few works, about 2 dozens. At the time, he was only permitted to print non-religious works because people were worried about kind of the rules of purity, the rules of tahara not being followed in print and in these print shops, and there wasn't that much of demand within society for these books. So it was really only in the 19th century, with the establishment of the state printing press in Egypt in 1821, that print really took off in the Arabic-speaking world. Now, you might think, why is that? Why so late? Why this kind of 300 some year gap between the adoption in Europe and the adoption in the Muslim world. This is a kind of more complicated question. I don't want to go so much into it. I have a few pages on this in my book, and if you're interested, we can talk about this in the Q&A. So the beginning of print, of really massive scale print, takes place in Egypt in 1821, and it starts with a statesman called Muhammad Ali, or Mehmet Ali, who is an Albanian, who is the ruler of Egypt at the time, and he wants to modernize the Egyptian state. He's basically the father of modern Egypt, and what he does is, for a modern state, he needs a modern bureaucracy, he needs a modern army. And how do you get these people? How do you get that? You need education, you need mass education. Right? You can't just leave education to the few and to the kind of seminaries that teach ulama, but you really need to have massive scale education. And for that he wants printing. And so his government establishes in a port town of Cairo called Bulaq, and that's why these early prints are called Bulaq prints, a state printing press that prints books for teaching engineers, teaching physicians, and then that produce textbooks for the newly established state schools, and that print kind of newspapers for bureaucrats throughout the country, and that then also produce translations from Italian, from French, whatever, from English, of new inventions and modern science for the establishment of a modern state. So now you're asking, what does it have to do with Islamic thought? Well, after a while, after about 1 or 2 decades, so it's really not until the 1840s and 50s, the Egyptian state says to private individuals, well, we're not using those presses all the time. There are actually downtimes when you could press stuff, where you can print things. You can use our machines, you can use our editors and our typesetters, etc., if you pay us a fee for it. So at that point, people can start publishing books that are not in the interest of the state, and so starting in the 1840s and particularly in the 1850s, you actually have people starting to print and publish Islamic works, religious thought, philosophy, but also dictionary, poetry, hadith, and so on in Egypt. And what is interesting is that this is also something that happens hand in hand with the establishment of modern libraries, right? So the kind of old style library, these awqaf libraries that are financed by kind of private donations that are attached to religious institutions. What the government in Egypt does, they say, well, these awqaf libraries, they're just not doing their jobs anymore. They're not. They don't look after their books in a responsible way. So we are breaking these awqaf and we are collecting all of this in a national library. And that's how the Dar al-Kutub al-Misriya, the Egyptian National Library, is formed in 1870. All these manuscripts are brought together that are kind of in public institutions. And at that point, it's a relatively small number. It's less than 20,000. Right? If you think about this, less than 20,000 books that are publicly available in Arabic, manuscripts. But of course, there's a lot of manuscripts that are held by private individuals. But so you have this Dar al-Kutub. The Al-Azhar had several small libraries within the structure. All of this was put together into one, and you have the same thing happening in Syria. The so-called Zahiriya library is also a place where all the local awqaf libraries are, all the books are gathered there. And what they do is the state, in each example, the state hires librarians. They start cataloging them systematically, So these libraries are then they have regulated office hours, etc., etc. And so once you have these libraries, it is also easier for people to then take these manuscripts, copy them, and then and print them. So the technology of print and the establishment of modern libraries also goes hand in hand with each other. And so at this point, different groups of people start printing classical works for their own specific agendas. Right? So you have some people who are interested in the reform of the Arabic language. So they want to publicize literature. They want to publicize prose literature like Al-Jahiz, or the speeches of Ali ibn Abi Talib in the Nahj al-Balagha, or they want poetry that is not available or difficult to get, that is published. There are some people who are interested in ethics, so they publish philosophical works on ethics, virtue ethics, or Sufi ethics. There are some people who are interested in classical fiqh, so some people publish early usul al-fiqh in order to make the argument that, for example, showing that Shafi'i didn't accept taqlid by jurists, and that he called for ijtihad. So you can see that, in the kind of debates between ijtihad and taqlid, that was used, right? Publishing of classical works was used for that purpose. There are people who are critical of popular religions like shrine visitation, etc. They published classical works that were also critical of shrine visitation, etc. So you can see that the debates that were going on in the 19th century and early 20th century were also debates that led to classical works being published that supported the people who are interested in these debates. To give you a more specific example, during World War I, a scholar from Aleppo called Bashir al-Ghazi, this is a specific Hanafi example. Bashir al-Ghazi went to Istanbul. At that time, Syria was, of course, still part of the Ottoman Empire. He went to Istanbul to represent the town of Aleppo for the Ottoman government. But in his free time, he went to the manuscript libraries in Istanbul, and he copied the Ahkam al-Quran of al-Jassas, right, the 10th century Iraqi Hanafi. And then after he had returned to Syria, he published the Ahkam al-Quran by al-Jassas for the first time. Right? So this was a book that was before not available to anywhere in the Arab world, as far as I know. He found a copy in Istanbul. He published it within a couple of years, and almost immediately it made an impact in India. Right? So a Syrian goes to Turkey, or goes to Istanbul, finds a manuscript, goes back to Syria, publishes it, and a man called Ubaidullah Sindhi in India reads this, and there's a section on Al-Amr bil-Ma'ruf and Nahy anil Munkar, and he's absolutely blown away by that section, and he says, "Oh, if only my Deobandi teachers had known about this. This is so amazing." So what print does is it really enables classical ideas that were not available to other people, to many even scholars, to be spread and popularized in a relatively short period of time. So finally, what I wanted to talk about is the actual challenges that these printers pushed against, and kind of maybe give you a little bit of an idea of how to read a published work on Islamic thought today. So in chapter 8 of my book, which is on philology, on the development of philology, I have something that I think that's relevant for people who are interested in reading Islamic thought. So if you think somebody is if you think about it practically, somebody wants to print a text, They have manuscripts. There's manuscripts of a book, and they want to print it. How do you get from the manuscript to the printed version? Do you just take any manuscript and print it? What if that manuscript wasn't a good copy? What if this was like the 8th generation of copies, right? And somewhere, at each stage, somebody dropped some text, and by the end, there's massive gaps of it. So how do you choose which manuscript to use to print? That is a question of textual criticism and of philology. One way you can say is, okay, I take the oldest text, for example. But just because it's the oldest, it doesn't necessarily mean it's the best. If it is the text by the author, and we do still have manuscripts that go back to the author. We have texts, for example, by Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani, the great commentator on Sahih Bukhari, for example. We have his autograph, the text that he wrote by his own hand. We still have that. But there are many other classical texts for which we don't have the text by the author, or the first copy, or the second copy. So we have like several generations of copies. And each copy, by its nature, if any one of you has ever copied a longer text by hand, there's some omission, there's some mistakes, there's some misreadings. Maybe there's the dots missing or whatever, so we don't quite know even how the word looks. What you want to do is you want to do this critically. So if you're familiar with Arabic, with publications, the good ones have something at the bottom of each page, which one would call a critical apparatus, meaning in the basically the footnotes, you have the variance between the manuscripts that are recorded. So somebody who's editing this text isn't just taking one manuscript and just printing this. If that's the case, then maybe there are big gaps, and that happens all the time. People are maybe not aware of better manuscripts, or people are lazy. They just want to make money. They don't want to go to great lengths. And it is a really difficult task to edit different texts, to read like 5-6 different manuscripts side by side and seeing, are there differences? What are the differences? How do I make sense of it? Which one do I prefer? So the editor basically has to make decisions, has to make this, if there's like different texts, which is the reading that you think is the most reliable one that you put in the main text, and then which ones do you record at the bottom, like as alternative ones from the different manuscripts, right? So that's an important choice to be made, and if you have different editions of the same text, that's something to look out for. To what extent does the editor actually give you the information about the different manuscripts that they've used? To what extent does the edition contain these variants in the footnotes, which will allow you, sometimes when you read the main text that doesn't make sense or there's some problems, you look at the footnote and say, oh, okay, actually there are these variants that can tell you a lot about a text. So with the development of print, you also have the development of philology, of critical ways of reading texts. And this also happens in conversation with Orientalist scholars, because let's not forget that while most classical Islamic texts were published in Muslim countries, Arabic-speaking countries, non-Arabic-speaking countries, right? India is another hub of print. Orientalist scholars also make great contributions to this, right? And so you have, particularly in the early 20th century, you have a competition between methodologies of how to edit texts, right? So there is really fruitful debates going on between Muslims and Orientalist scholars about what exactly is the right way in which you approach texts and you publish texts. And there's even among some Muslim scholars, there's kind of an exchange of methodologies going on. And so, let's say, as a simple example, in the traditional Muslim manuscript culture, they also, the really good manuscripts also noted variations, but like when somebody wanted to copy a text, and they were really good copyists, by hand, they also would look at different manuscripts, and then they would note the variants on the margins, right? Al hawashi. Or now today, basically, Arabic editions do this in the footnotes the way that Orientalists did it, right? So in that sense, the kind of Orientalist the ways of printing have been adopted. But there's a whole kind of there's a whole history to the philology of Arabic print. If you look at the early Bulaq editions, they don't mention which manuscripts they use. They don't have a critical apparatus, etc. But particularly starting in the early 20th century, you then have that movement of people saying, no, we have to actually be more rigorous in this methodologically. Of course, if you buy Dar al-Kutub al-Almiya editions, the kind of the McDonald's edition of Islamic thought from Lebanon, most of the time, I mean, there are exceptions, but most of the time they have no. Very often they are pirated copies, and they don't have any critical apparatus at the bottom. But if you look at better editions, you will also find this. So that's something to look out for when you buy a classical text. So my book ends in 1940. This is a point when, shortly before the end of World War II, when most of Arabic-speaking Muslim countries would become independent, and then things change a little bit about the publishing industry. That's why I decided to stop there. But really what I wanted to convey to the reader in my book is that Islamic thought is that we encounter today when we go to a bookshop, when we go to a library, is something that has been brought to us by generations of editors that have done the hard work for us. So on the one hand, it's in a way, it's a service. And for me, it was a kind of a labor of gratitude to those people on which we rely so much when we want to look at Islamic thought, at classical Islamic thought particularly. But at the same time, also to be aware that by looking at printed materials, we are also looking at the Islamic tradition through the eyes of specific people who had specific concerns, right? So the reason why when you go into a bookshop, you rarely see, 5 levels of commentary on a text being sold, is that these were the texts that were produced in maybe the 18th or 19th century. But in the new reading public that was created by the modern state, right? Most people who do not grow up in a madrasa system, or exclusively in a madrasa system, right, where you start learning, kind of reading these layers of commentaries. Today, it's very difficult to even understand what these texts are about. So what print did was it gave us a lot of classical works that had very few copies left, but it also kind of pushed other works, kind of the later works, the 17th, 18th century. Kind of commentary tradition, kind of out of our reach and out of our interest, because these are texts that had a very small group of people who were able to read them, and kind of the print market just isn't interested in these kind of texts anymore. So what I'm saying is that print has changed the kind of classics of Islamic thought. It changed what an educated Muslim has on their bookshelf, and we have to be aware of that history if we want to study the Islamic intellectual tradition in a serious way. And that's what I've got to say. Thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to your questions. Okay, so the first question I see is, please explain the 300-year gap between Gutenberg and Muhammad Ali. So there are different ways in which people try to understand this, so the first thing I think that's important to keep in mind is that we shouldn't necessarily think of this gap as some sort of underdevelopment necessarily. It doesn't just because Arabs didn't adopt print. I mean, that's not necessarily a failure, right? I mean, if you look at the case of China, for example, the Chinese adopted print at some point, and then they left it and went back to manuscript, and then they adopted print again. So it's this kind of progressive kind of ideology, which means that if there's a technology to do X, then any reasonable person will do it, right? So if there are cell phones, then any reasonable society will adopt cell phones, for example, right? That's not necessarily true. You could imagine a society that says, well, cell phones has all these negative, right? I mean, any new invention has negative parts, right? People become antisocial, kids, whatever, they have attention deficit, whatever problems. So we don't adopt that. So now, what were the conditions that led Muslim societies to not adopt print? That's the question I would ask. For a long time, people believed that Muslim states actually had outlawed print, and you still find this in accounts of the Ottomans, for example. There's an account that Ottoman sultans outlawed print, but there's actually no evidence that this happened. I mean, we don't have any Ottoman documents that would outlaw print. So for me, the most likely explanation is that first of all, there just wasn't enough of a market there. There was no financial incentive to switch to print. So first thing to keep in mind is that these Muslim empires, they were multilingual empires, right? So when print was invented in Europe, let's say the Ottoman Empire, they spoke all kind of languages, right? The Ottomans spoke Turkish, and then their Armenian community spoke Armenian, and their Greek Christians spoke Greek, and the Arabs spoke Arabic, and they had populations that spoke Persian. Even kind of some of the Ottoman high culture they spoke Persian, and then there were people who spoke Arabic. So first of all, that limits the let's say the demand for specific language publication. Secondly, if the percentage of literate people in your society is low, right? Then the question is it worth printing a book? If you print a book, if you print a book and you only want 50 copies, it's cheaper to copy it by hand, because if you want a printing press, first of all you need to buy a printing press. Printing in Arabic is a bit more difficult because the letters look different at the beginning and the middle and the end, so that you need 3 times more letters than you do if you do Latin print. And then you need to hire somebody to do the typesetting, and you need materials, because you have all this expense at the beginning. And let's say, because you don't print 50 copies, you would print 1,500 copies, 2,000 copies, right? So you also have a risk, because what if people don't buy that stuff, right? So if you only have few takers, then print just doesn't make economic sense, right? And so that would be for me the most likely explanation, that the degree of literacy just wasn't high enough to make print economically viable at this time period. And of course, then we see that once you have the development of the modern state, which goes with modern mass education, right? So suddenly you have a great market of people who want to read books, and they read books, and they buy books, and then of course after there's a government press, then you have private presses growing up all over Egypt, and then Egypt stays the kind of center until the kind of mid 20th century. Then in the Arab world it kind of moves to Lebanon, but very early on you have printing presses all over the place, in North Africa, Syria, Iraq, etc., etc. But Egypt, remains really a center until the mid-20th century, where people from outside go and print their books. So we have examples of people from East Africa printing Arabic Islamic books that were produced in East Africa, whatever, in Zanzibar or wherever, go to Egypt and have it printed there. Sorry, that was a long answer. That was a long, yeah. Yeah, the printing of the Mus'haf. So that's a good question. Now, I don't know whether you know this, but the first Mus'haf was actually printed in Europe, right? In the 16th century. The first time the Mus'haf was printed by non-Muslims. There was most people are familiar with the 1924 Mus'haf that was printed in Egypt, which was a kind of a government affair. But the Mus'haf was printed already in the 19th century in Egypt, Istanbul, in Iran, in Kazan, in kind of Tatar Kazan, and in India, and there is the issue of what is the problem. I mean, the great power of print, of course, is that you can have thousands of copies. The problem, and that's also a problem, right? So if once you print a book, if you were to misprint a Quran, then you immediately with one shot you have thousands of misprinted Qurans. So that is an immediate problem. In fact, if you know the history of Oxford University Press, it was founded because a British printer printed the Bible and the Ten Commandments, and he misprinted it, and the misprint was very unfortunate because instead of printing the prohibition of fornication, it is actually a permission of fornication in that misprint, and that's the government then took this printer to task, and that's how Oxford University Press was founded in order to control this printing press, to make sure that they wouldn't misprint important texts like this. So you can find already in the 19th century, the Ottoman state puts together a committee of scholars that check on prints of the Quran, and that they would give a stamp of approval if it's correct. And so only the Masahif that had the stamp were permitted to be sold. And so there is that's the main issue that comes up. But I mentioned a little bit before that there were suspicions of whether the rules of purity were followed in these print shops, and the fear that texts were not given the kind of dignity and respect that there would be among copyists, right? So that is a little bit there as well. But I don't know. Is that? I hope I answered your question. Yeah, I mean, if you look at the early Orientalist editions, they don't look different from the Bulaq editions. If you look at these two, they look the same, right? In terms of what you see. But then in the mid 19th century, you have this movement of kind of textual criticism that tries to take the study of texts really to the level of a science. And the one kind of real discovery that they make, and the real progress that they make, is the development of the stemma. So a stemma is the idea that if you take all the surviving manuscripts of a text, you can put them into relationship like family relationships. That sounds weird, but what you do is, when you look at copyist mistakes in the manuscripts, you can chart them and see, okay, let's say somebody copied a text and and forgot a sentence. That happens very often. Like a line, they skip one line, and so in their copy that line isn't there anymore. Yeah, and then of course afterwards, when this text gets recopied, people are not adding that line. It's just that line is gone, right? So you can, if you have this body of text and you look at all the different things that are missing, you can see, okay, so these texts were copied from this text, right? So it becomes like a family tree, yeah, by looking at common mistakes. And once you do that, you can do interesting things, right? So for example, if you say these three texts are descendants from another text, like let's say from like we have four texts, and we can prove that these three texts are descendants from this fourth text. Then you can say, for the edition of this text, I don't need to look at these three texts because they're just copies of this other text, right? So you can in fact figure out which texts you need to take into consideration for editing a text once you've done the stemma. You can do interesting stuff with reconstructing texts through the development of this thematic analysis. There are some. I mean, I have a longish discussion on this in my book. This method was developed in the study of Greco-Roman texts, right? Greek and Roman texts and Latin texts. Sometimes it doesn't make sense for Arabic texts because, you know, as I mentioned, we do have autograph texts, for example, right? So for that we wouldn't need this methodology. Latin and Greek texts of antiquity, we never have the autograph. You know, we always have at least 4 or 5 generations removed from the origin. So we need kind of different tools. But the Orientalist, I mean, the great Orientalist editions are fantastic works, right? But these are very often professors who've spent like 30 years of their lives editing this text. In the kind of early development of print, Islamic in the Muslim world, the people who were responsible for this printing were they were employees of a press, and they gave them a task to this musahih, they were called musahih, and said, okay, here, this is the text, prepare this for print. And they had like a specific time period. They were working on the clock for it. So they didn't have the kind of, you know, they were not, you know, tenured professors who had all the time in the world, right, to do this until they were happy with it. They just had to get it done. Now these are the early decades of print. Now by the early 20th century, like 1911, it's the first time that that the term muhaqqiq appears on a book by a man called Ahmed Zaki Basha. Now, I talk about him quite a bit in my book. So he's the first person who does not work for the printing press. He is an independent scholar, and he's the one who takes as much time as he wants to. Right? From that time period onwards, you have this development of these people who, scholars, intellectuals, who prepare the text, and then once they have finished the text, they then bring it to the printers, right? Which has a vast impact on the quality of texts. But I mean, the very idea of financing is really difficult, right? Like first of all, like how do you know where the manuscripts are for a text? Right? First, you need libraries that are catalogued. If you don't have catalogued libraries, you don't know where the manuscripts are. Yeah, so you need to have libraries that are catalogued. Then you have the ability either to go there and get a copy, or to have the networks to get a copy through your friends or whatever. So all of this kind of happens, takes time, right? You have development of, already Ahmed Zaki goes around to Europe, for example, to photograph manuscripts and bring them back to Egypt to edit. You have networks of scholars. So you have Indian scholars who write to Egyptian scholars, who write then to their Ottoman colleagues, to find manuscripts. It's also like a search for manuscripts, and then they send them to Egypt to be printed. Yeah, that's another topic that I do mention. So I don't know whether you've seen that question. So what about kind of uh, the possibility of people manipulating early texts for print, and thereby kind of manipulating our memory of classical works? That's a really good question. And I have some discussion on this in my book. In fact, while writing my book, I discovered that there's a book that people have considered to be a classical work, where the whole book is just made up. It was never written, and it's in order to justify the Sayyidah Zainab Mosque in Cairo. So Sayyidah Zainab is a granddaughter of the Prophet Muhammad, but all historical, there's no evidence that she was buried in Cairo, but you have this mosque there that is named after her and that has her shrine, and it's a big deal for Egyptians. But once you have print and all these histories of Egypt are printed, people say, you know what, until the 17th century or until the 16th century, there is no mention anywhere of the granddaughter of the Prophet being buried in Cairo. So how is it possible that only in the 16th century we discovered? Like, that's not possible. They would have known this. They didn't know it for the first 1,000 years of Egyptian Muslim history, and then they discovered it suddenly. That's not possible. And then this person who was kind of trying to defend this shrine discovered this work that showed Sayyidah Zainab moving to Cairo, and it can be shown to be spurious. So he forged this text to justify the shrine of Sayyidah Zainab. So that's a question that exists. It exists in European the history of print in Europe, that people forged text or forged parts of text or omitted parts of text, and of course that becomes also a big deal in the kind of religious polemics, like in the polemics between various currents of Muslims, right? And so I started with talking about Al-Alusi's tafsir, 19th century tafsir. So the late Ottoman scholar Muhammad Zahid al-Kawthari, he alleged that Al-Alusi's son, so the Mahmud al-Alusi, who's the writer of this tafsir, he was this great Ottoman scholar, but his son went more into the Salafi direction. So this Muhammad Zahid al-Kawthari alleged that his son, the printed version was printed by his son. His son brought the text to Cairo where it was printed. So al-Kawthari alleged that his son had manipulated the text to put in things that were critical of ziyara and the kind of shrine veneration. Again, that is not true. Like we have the original manuscript of Al-Alusi, and these sections are originally from the father, not from the son. Did not put that in there. So we do sometimes have people manipulating text, but then also sometimes people allege manipulations, right, if they don't like what the text says. Right? So another issue, of course, a classical text gets published and it goes against what you think proper Islam is. How do you somehow argue that this isn't right? You say, well, there's something forged. Some people did something with this text that's not true. So that's that's an important thing, but the more we have classical, the more we have critical editions that really look at various manuscripts that are open about this, etc. These days, of course, very often, you can actually look at the manuscripts, right? Online, even you can find them. The clearer the picture gets, and the more these manipulations get found out. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So the question is, what is the benefit of book recital, kind of a book recital majlis in the modern period? Well, that's a good point. If you if you're interested in this topic, Garrett Davidson, who did a dissertation at the University of Chicago, has just published a book. Garrett Davidson is his name, on kind of hadith scholarship, hadith like ijaza culture, etc. And that's not just about print; it's in fact pre-print. And a lot of these sessions of people sitting together and reading hadith works, right, transmitting hadith works, they're not about teaching you that book, right? I mean, you know, there are these fast reading sessions where it's just like somebody is just. If you could kind of, I didn't see that question. If you can somehow repost this about a question for us. So what I'm saying is that these fast reading sessions, for example, they're not about you really understanding everything that's said or explaining it or whatever. It's a type of barakah thing. You know, it's a type of, you know, I've participated in this. It's a culture in which you say, okay, there is a connection. There is a continuity of these texts being taught. It's not about. I mean, this is not a replacement for sitting down and reading it slowly and understanding it. So it has a social dimension. It has a communal dimension. But I mean, but then of course there are also sessions where people sit together slowly and read text slowly to understand it. Right? But it really depends what you mean. I mean, there is of course with the, I mean, like private reading, silent reading is also something that exists way before print, right? It's not that people always read stuff together. We have a lot of examples from the classical period where people read by themselves, right? I mentioned Al-Jahid, the famous prose writer, who rented bookshops at night in order to just lock himself in and just read these books by himself. So it's not that classical Islam, you know, all the books were read aloud or something like this. I mean, there's a specific kind of specific meaning, specific occasions where specifically important books are read aloud. But I mean, of course, then there are also readings of Sahih Bukhari to avert, like when there's an earthquake or plague or whatever, to kind of avert evil. You know, that's related to kind of ideas of barakah, etc. I don't know whether that's an answer, but I still didn't get this ibadur. Oh yeah, okay. Okay, so here he's Ibadur Rahman asks, would it be too simplistic to say that a reliance upon visions and dreams instead of books is a sign of the decline in your assessment in the standards of post-classical scholasticism? Okay, that's something I didn't talk about here. That's a section in my book about kind of pre-print scholarly culture in which I see you know, a kind of greater emphasis on things like ilham as a source of knowledge, that kind of intellectually ambitious students would basically be kind of told that, you know, the kind of the pinnacle of scholarly, of kind of achievement, of intellectual achievement, is not to read as many books as you can, but it is in fact to reach the level where you know things through a type of kind of ilhami knowledge, kind of kashf, kind of non-rational cognition. And well, I do think it is a sign of decline in a specific position, like in a specific, once it is taken to be the replacement for book learning, right? I mean, anybody, I mean, even in kind of in scholarly circles that have no sense for the divine or for anything supernatural, there is a place for things like intuition, for example, right? Um, but the point is that once that becomes an authoritative argument, that I had a dream vision last night, or that I saw, the claims that I saw the prophet and the prophet told me this. Well, which I don't know. Who am I to say that's not true? But that's not a valid argument for action of other people, right? Because, and if you look at classical scholars really rejected that as a source of knowledge. The reason why they rejected it as a source of knowledge, I mentioned Abu Bakr al-Jassas in his Al-Fusul, the earliest Hanafi Usul book that we have. He says, if somebody tells you, I had a vision about this, that, and the other, you just tell him, well, I had a vision that you're wrong. What are they going to do? I mean, that's just like it's not an argument, right? I mean, it might have been true what you said, but I don't know. And so you can't make these kind of visions the basis of knowledge as a social practice, because that undermines it. Because there's no then it's just about charisma, right? Then it's just that, because then you need to have all these karamat, right? Then I need to tell you stories of me walking over water and flying in the air. Then you might believe what my intuition or whatever my kashf was, right? If you want to do this as a replacement of of some sort of other types of arguments, and when we look at books, for example, I give this example of Abdul Qadir al-Jazairi. He is this famous, of course, Algerian mujahid who, after he's defeated by the French, he settles down in Damascus and becomes an Ibn Arabi scholar. And there are texts attributed to Ibn Arabi that are not by Ibn Arabi. Everybody knows, I think by now everybody knows that if you look at the text, if you read the text that we know of Ibn Arabi and these texts, you know that this is not authentic. Philologically speaking, we can establish that they're not authentic. But his arguments in the early 20th, or in the kind of mid 20th century, 19th century, are that, I saw Ibn Arabi in a dream and he told me these are lies, right? Again, that's not a good argument, right? That's not a superior argument in any way, in any sense, because then I just have to judge you or whatever. But you can make an argument that is watertight why this can't have been by Ibn Arabi. A textual argument, a philological argument. So in that sense, yes, I do believe that.
Okay, so thank you very much, Professor Shamsi. This has been a very enlightening lecture, and I think the questions attest to that as well. So thank you very much for joining us, and for everyone who's attending, please stay tuned with our social media. We'll be announcing our next few lectures very soon, inshallah. So jazakumullah khair. Everyone have a good night. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam, and thank you for coming.